Before there was a United States, before there was a flag, a constitution, or a single president, this land already had thousands of years of history behind it. In the next hour, we're going to travel through the entire story of America, from the first humans who crossed into this continent more than 16,000 years ago, to colonies, revolution, civil war, world wars, moon landings, and the America you recognize today. This is a big story. It has heroes, it has villains, it has moments of incredible courage, and moments the country still hasn't fully come to terms with. We're not going to skip the hard parts, and we're not going to skip the proud parts either. Let's start at the very beginning.
Long before Columbus, long before any European ship touched these shores, human beings were already here and had been for thousands of years. Most archaeologists believe the first people arrived at least 16,000 to 20,000 years ago, likely through Beringia and possibly along Pacific coastal routes, crossing from Siberia into what is now Alaska during the last ice age, when sea levels were much lower. From there, over countless generations, people spread south and east, eventually populating both North and South America entirely. Over the thousands of years that followed, hundreds of distinct nations and cultures developed across the continent. In the Northeast, the Iroquois Confederacy formed a sophisticated political alliance between multiple nations. In the Southeast, you had the Cherokee and the Creek. On the Great Plains, nations like the Sioux and the Comanche built cultures deeply connected to the buffalo. In the Southwest, the Pueblo peoples built multi-story adobe cities, and the Navajo and Apache developed their own distinct traditions. One of the most remarkable pre-European civilizations was the Mississippian culture, which flourished from roughly 800 to 1600 AD. At its peak, Cahokia was one of the largest cities north of Mexico, complete with massive earthen mounds, plazas, and a complex society. They had agriculture, corn, beans, and squash grown together in a method known as the Three Sisters. They had trade networks stretching across the continent, governments, religions, art, and oral histories going back centuries. In 1492, an Italian explorer sailing under the flag of Spain, Christopher Columbus, crossed the Atlantic Ocean looking for a western route to Asia. Instead, he landed in the Caribbean. He never actually set foot on the North American mainland, but his voyage opened the floodgates. Within decades, Spain, France, England, Portugal, and the Netherlands were all racing to explore, claim, and exploit the New World. Spain moved fastest. Spanish explorers pushed into Florida, the Southwest, and Central and South America, often through brutal conquest. In 1513, Juan Ponce de Leon landed in what's now Florida, and in 1565, the Spanish founded St. Augustine, Florida, which remains the oldest continuously occupied European established city in the present-day United States.
But it was England that would ultimately shape what became the United States. In 1607, English settlers established Jamestown, Virginia, the first permanent English colony in North America. It was funded by the Virginia Company, and the early years were brutal. Disease, starvation, and conflict with the local Powhatan Nation nearly wiped the colony out. Then, in 1619, English privateers brought a group of captive Africans to Virginia, an event widely regarded as the symbolic beginning of race-based slavery in English North America, a system that would eventually enslave millions of people. The following year, in 1620, the Pilgrims sailed on the Mayflower and landed at Plymouth, Massachusetts, signing the Mayflower Compact before they even disembarked, an early seed of American self-governance. So already, in these first few decades, two very different threads were being woven into the American story: the pursuit of liberty and self-government, and the establishment of slavery.
Over the course of the 1600s, England kept expanding its foothold in North America. Eventually, 13 colonies stretched along the Atlantic coast: Virginia, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Maryland, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Delaware, North Carolina, South Carolina, New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, and the last one founded in 1732, Georgia. These colonies developed into three distinct regions. New England built its economy around fishing, shipbuilding, and trade, with tightly knit Puritan communities. The middle colonies were more diverse, both economically and religiously, with a mix of farming and commerce. Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania, would go on to become one of the most important cities in early American history. And the southern colonies, Virginia, Maryland, the Carolinas, Georgia, built plantation-based agricultural economies, growing cash crops like tobacco, rice, and indigo. That economy became increasingly, and then almost entirely, dependent on enslaved labor. By the 18th century, slavery wasn't a marginal institution in the South. It was the economic engine. Throughout this period, the transatlantic slave trade forcibly transported enslaved Africans across the ocean in horrific conditions. Then, in the mid-1700s, the French and Indian War, from 1754 to 1763, the North American theater of the 7 Years' War, pitted Britain and its American colonists against France and various Native American allies. Britain won, gaining control of Canada and territory east of the Mississippi River. But that victory came at a massive cost, leaving Britain deeply in debt and looking to its American colonies to help pay the bill. To pay down its war debt, the British government began imposing a series of new taxes directly on the American colonies, taxes the colonists had no say in. This is where you get the phrase, "no taxation without representation." In 1765, Britain passed the Stamp Act, taxing virtually all printed materials in the colonies. Colonists organized boycotts and protests that forced Britain to repeal it, but more taxes followed. Tensions kept rising. In 1770, in the Boston Massacre, British soldiers opened fire on a crowd of colonists in Boston, killing 5 people. It became a powerful piece of anti-British propaganda. Then, in 1773, came the Boston Tea Party. In protest of the Tea Act, a group of colonists disguised themselves and boarded British ships in Boston Harbor, dumping an entire shipment of tea into the water. Britain's response was severe. Parliament passed the Intolerable Acts to punish Massachusetts. Instead, the acts pushed the colonies together. In 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies met in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. Then, on April 19, 1775, British troops marched to seize colonial weapon stockpiles near Boston and clashed with colonial militia at Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts. Shots were fired. People died. The American Revolutionary War had begun. With war already underway, the Second Continental Congress appointed George Washington, a Virginia planter and experienced military officer, to command the newly formed Continental Army. For the first year of fighting, most colonists weren't even calling for full independence. But as fighting dragged on, opinion shifted. Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, published in early 1776, made a blunt and hugely influential case for full independence. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress formally adopted the Declaration of Independence. Written primarily by Thomas Jefferson, it laid out the philosophical case for independence, that all men are created equal, that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed. It's worth noting the irony historians point out. Jefferson himself, like many founders, owned enslaved people, even as he wrote those words. The war itself was long and difficult. The Continental Army was underfunded, undersupplied, and often outmatched by British professional soldiers. Washington suffered painful defeats, including the loss of New York City, and endured a brutal winter at Valley Forge in 1777-78, where his army nearly fell apart from cold, hunger, and disease. But in 1777, The Americans won a major victory at the Battle of Saratoga in New York, convincing France that the Americans could actually win. France formally allied with the United States in 1778. The decisive blow came in 1781 at the Siege of Yorktown, Virginia, where American and French forces trapped the British Army under General Cornwallis, who surrendered. Finally, in 1783, the Treaty of Paris formally ended the war, and Britain recognized the independence of the United States of America. Independence was won, but the hardest part, actually building a functioning country, was just beginning. The first attempt at a national government was the Articles of Confederation, adopted in 1781, which deliberately created a very weak central government. But that weakness became a huge problem. The federal government couldn't levy taxes, regulate trade, or maintain a real army. So in 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention. Delegates like James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and Benjamin Franklin, with George Washington presiding, produced the United States Constitution, a federal system with 3 separate branches of government designed to check and balance each other's power.
One of the most consequential compromises baked into that Constitution was the 3/5 compromise, which counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for purposes of congressional representation and taxation. In 1788, the Constitution was ratified by the required 9 states and took effect. In 1789, George Washington was unanimously elected and inaugurated as the first president of the United States. In 1791, the Bill of Rights was ratified, guaranteeing freedoms like speech, religion, the press, and due process of law. Even in these earliest years, deep political divisions emerged between Alexander Hamilton's Federalists and Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republicans. As the 19th century began, the United States was still young and fragile, but about to grow dramatically. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson pulled off the Louisiana Purchase. For roughly $15 million, the U.S. bought about 828,000 square miles of territory from France, instantly doubling the size of the country. Jefferson commissioned the Lewis and Clark expedition, which set out in 1804 and spent 2 years mapping a route to the Pacific, guided in significant part by a Shoshone woman named Sacagawea. In 1812, simmering tensions with Britain erupted into the War of 1812, which included the British burning of Washington, D.C., and the defense of Fort McHenry in Baltimore, inspiring Francis Scott Key to write The Star-Spangled Banner. The war ended in 1815, in essentially a stalemate.
As the country expanded westward, the question of slavery kept resurfacing. In 1820, the Missouri Compromise admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state simultaneously, while banning slavery north of a specific latitude line in future territories. Meanwhile, the U.S. government pursued an aggressive and often violent policy toward Native American nations. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act. The most devastating episode came in 1838 and 1839, when the Cherokee Nation was forcibly marched westward in what became known as the Trail of Tears. Thousands of Cherokee people died from cold, disease, and starvation along the way. The country kept pushing west. In 1836, American settlers in Texas declared independence after battles including the famous defense of the Alamo, and won it at the Battle of San Jacinto. Texas existed as its own republic before the United States annexed it in 1845. That annexation, combined with a border dispute, triggered the Mexican-American War in 1846, which ended in 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, in which Mexico ceded an enormous stretch of territory to the United States. That same year, 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention in New York launched the organized women's rights and suffrage movement, with activists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton calling for women's right to vote. And gold was discovered in California, triggering the California Gold Rush. By the 1850s, the United States was, in a very real sense, two different countries sharing one government. In 1850, the Compromise of 1850 included a harsh new Fugitive Slave Act. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act let new territories decide the slavery question themselves through popular vote, resulting in the violent period known as Bleeding Kansas. In 1857, the Supreme Court's ruling in Dred Scott v. Sanford declared that enslaved people were not U.S. citizens and had no right to sue in federal court. Then, in 1860, Abraham Lincoln won the presidential election. Fearing his administration would move to restrict or end slavery, Southern states began seceding from the Union. By early 1861, 11 states had formed the Confederate States of America. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter, a federal fort in South Carolina. The American Civil War had begun.
The Civil War would become the deadliest conflict in American history, killing an estimated 600 to 750,000 soldiers. Early in the war, Lincoln's primary stated goal was preserving the Union, not necessarily ending slavery outright. But as the war dragged on, Lincoln shifted course. On January 1, 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory were free. It fundamentally transformed the purpose of the war into a fight against slavery itself, and opened the door for roughly 200,000 black soldiers to serve in the Union Army.
The war's turning point came in July of 1863 at the Battle of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania, a brutal 3-day battle that resulted in a Union victory and roughly 50,000 combined casualties, making Gettysburg the bloodiest single battle of the Civil War. Months later, Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address, a short speech that redefined the war as a struggle to ensure that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The war ground on for 2 more brutal years. Union General Ulysses S. Grant pursued a strategy of relentless attrition, while General William Tecumseh Sherman led a devastating march through Georgia and the Carolinas. Finally, in April 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, effectively ending the war. But the country's relief was shattered almost immediately. Just 5 days after Lee's surrender, on April 14, 1865, President Lincoln was shot by John Wilkes Booth while attending a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. He died the next morning, the first American president ever assassinated. Later that same year, in December 1865, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, formally and permanently abolishing slavery throughout the United States. With the war over and slavery abolished, the country faced an enormous question. How do you rebuild a nation and integrate 4 million newly freed people into American society? This period, from 1865 to 1877, is known as Reconstruction. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, granted citizenship to all people born in the United States. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, prohibited denying the right to vote based on race. But this progress faced fierce resistance. Southern state governments passed black codes, and a white supremacist terrorist organization, the Ku Klux Klan, emerged during this period. In 1877, following a disputed presidential election, federal troops withdrew from the South, effectively ending Reconstruction. In the decades that followed, Southern states systematically enacted Jim Crow laws that would remain in place for nearly a century. While the South grappled with the aftermath of Reconstruction, the rest of the country was being utterly transformed by industrialization. The late 1800s became known as the Gilded Age. This era produced enormously powerful industrialists. John D. Rockefeller built a near-total monopoly over the American oil industry through Standard Oil. Andrew Carnegie dominated the steel industry. J.P. Morgan became one of the most powerful figures in American finance. In 1869, the completion of the first transcontinental railroad connected the country coast to coast, built substantially through the labor of Chinese and Irish immigrant workers. Meanwhile, in 1876, at the Battle of Little Bighorn, an alliance of Lakota, Cheyenne, and other warriors defeated U.S. Army forces led by George Armstrong Custer. But by 1890, the era of large-scale native armed resistance largely ended with the Wounded Knee Massacre in South Dakota, where U.S. troops killed an estimated 250 to 300 Lakota men, women, and children. As the 1800s came to a close, the United States began flexing its power well beyond its own borders. In 1898, the Spanish-American War resulted in the U.S. gaining control of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Domestically, the early 1900s brought the Progressive Era, often driven by investigative journalists nicknamed muckrakers. In 1903, the Wright brothers achieved the first successful powered airplane flight at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. In 1913, the 16th Amendment established the federal income tax, and the Federal Reserve System was created. And in 1920, after decades of activism, tracing back to Seneca Falls in 1848, the 19th Amendment guaranteed women across the country the right to vote.
In 1914, a massive war broke out across Europe. In 1917, after Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare and the interception of the Zimmermann telegram, America entered World War I on the side of the Allies. The war ended in November 1918, but brought a new catastrophe: a global influenza pandemic that killed an estimated 50 million people worldwide. In 1919, the 18th Amendment banned the manufacture and sale of alcohol nationwide, ushering in Prohibition, which fueled organized crime empires like Al Capone's in Chicago. The 1920s became known as the Roaring Twenties, a period of rapid economic growth and enormous cultural creativity, especially the Harlem Renaissance and the explosive popularity of jazz music. In October 1929, the stock market crashed, triggering the Great Depression, the most severe and prolonged economic crisis in American history. Unemployment eventually reached roughly 25%. Families lost homes and farms, including in farming regions hit by the Dust Bowl, forcing hundreds of thousands to migrate west. In 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt took office and launched the New Deal, including public works programs like the Works Progress Administration and the Civilian Conservation Corps, and in 1935, the creation of Social Security. The New Deal fundamentally and permanently changed the role of the federal government in American life. In 1939, war broke out again in Europe, and soon after in Asia. For over 2 years, the United States officially remained neutral. Then, on December 7, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, killing over 2,000 Americans. The very next day, the United States declared war on Japan, and within days, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States as well. In 1942, the U.S. government forcibly relocated and interned roughly 120,000 Japanese Americans, the majority of them U.S. citizens, into detention camps based purely on their ancestry. It is now widely recognized as a grave violation of civil liberties. On the battlefield, American forces fought across North Africa, Italy, the Pacific Islands, and eventually into Western Europe. The single largest turning point in the European theater came on June 6, 1944, D-Day, when Allied forces, including massive numbers of American troops, launched the largest seaborne invasion in history on the beaches of Normandy, France. Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, but the war in the Pacific against Japan continued. Facing the prospect of an extraordinarily costly invasion of the Japanese home islands, the United States made the fateful decision to use a devastating new weapon, the atomic bomb.
On August 6, 1945, the U.S. dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan, and on August 9th, another on Nagasaki. The bombings killed well over 100,000 people, the vast majority civilians, with many more dying later from radiation exposure. And they remain the only use of nuclear weapons in warfare in human history. Japan surrendered shortly after, officially ending World War II. The war left the United States as one of the two dominant superpowers left standing. With Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan defeated, a new global rivalry emerged between the United States and the Soviet Union. This decades-long standoff became known as the Cold War. In 1947, President Truman announced the Truman Doctrine. In 1948, the Marshall Plan committed billions of dollars to rebuilding Western Europe. In 1949, the United States and its allies formed NATO, and that same year, the Soviet Union tested its own atomic bomb. From 1950 to 1953, the U.S. led a United Nations coalition in the Korean War. At home, fear of communist infiltration fueled the era of McCarthyism in the early to mid-1950s. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, igniting the space race. While the Cold War played out globally, a different kind of struggle was intensifying at home, the fight to finally dismantle the system of legal racial segregation. The modern civil rights movement gained enormous momentum starting in the mid-1950s. In 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a segregated bus in Montgomery, Alabama, sparking the Montgomery bus boycott, a protest that launched a young minister named Martin Luther King Jr. into national leadership. Over the following years, King and countless other activists organized nonviolent protests, sit-ins, and marches across the South, often facing brutal violence from police and white supremacist mobs. In August 1963, hundreds of thousands of people gathered in Washington, D.C. for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, where King delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Just months later, in November 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, shocking the nation and the world. Kennedy's successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, pushed forward major civil rights legislation. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 outlawed discriminatory voting practices that had been used for decades to disenfranchise black voters. At the same time, American involvement in Vietnam was escalating dramatically, growing through the 1960s under Presidents Kennedy, Johnson, and later Nixon into a massive and deeply controversial war. As casualties mounted, it triggered massive anti-war protests across American college campuses and cities. American combat involvement finally ended in 1973, and the war itself concluded in 1975 with the fall of Saigon. Amid all this turmoil, there was also a moment of extraordinary triumph. In July 1969, American astronaut Neil Armstrong became the first human being to walk on the surface of the moon during the Apollo 11 mission. In 1972, operatives connected to President Richard Nixon's re-election campaign broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex. What began as a minor burglary unraveled into a massive political scandal. Facing near certain impeachment, Nixon resigned from the presidency in August 1974, the only U.S. president in history to do so. Under President Ronald Reagan, elected in 1980, the U.S. pursued a major military buildup and a more confrontational stance toward the Soviet Union. In November 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and in 1991, the Soviet Union itself formally dissolved. After more than 4 decades, the Cold War was over. With the Cold War over, the 1990s under President Bill Clinton became a period of significant economic growth and rapid technological change as the internet moved from a niche academic tool into something reshaping everyday life. In 1991, the U.S. led an international coalition in the Gulf War. The decade also saw the North American Free Trade Agreement in 1994. The decade wasn't without serious turmoil either. The 1995 Oklahoma City bombing, which killed 168 people, and the 1998 impeachment of President Clinton by the House of Representatives, who was later acquitted by the Senate.
On September 11, 2001, terrorists affiliated with the extremist group Al-Qaeda hijacked 4 commercial airplanes. 2 were flown into the World Trade Center towers in New York City, causing both towers to collapse. A 3rd struck the Pentagon outside Washington, D.C. A 4th crashed into a field in Pennsylvania after passengers fought back. Nearly 3,000 people were killed. In direct response, the U.S. launched the war in Afghanistan later in 2001. In 2003, the United States also invaded Iraq, based on claims later shown to be inaccurate that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction.
In 2008, cracks in the American housing market and financial system triggered a global financial crisis, the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. That same year, Barack Obama was elected the first African-American president of the United States. In 2010, Obama signed the Affordable Care Act, often called Obamacare, into law. In May 2011, U.S. Special Forces killed Osama bin Laden, the al-Qaeda leader responsible for planning the September 11th attacks, in a raid in Pakistan.
The 2010s brought rapid social and technological change. The rise of smartphones and social media reshaped how Americans communicated, consumed news, and engaged in politics, often deepening existing political and cultural divisions. In 2016, businessman and reality television personality Donald Trump was elected the 45th President of the United States in a campaign and result that surprised much of the political establishment. The years that followed were marked by intense political polarization and a media and information environment increasingly split along partisan lines.
In early 2020, a novel coronavirus, COVID-19, spread rapidly into the United States, triggering a public health crisis unlike anything the country had experienced in a century, eventually killing well over 1 million Americans. That same year, the killing of George Floyd, a black man, by a Minneapolis police officer was captured on video and sparked massive nationwide protests over police violence and racial injustice. In the 2020 presidential election, Joe Biden defeated incumbent President Donald Trump. On January 6, 2021, a mob of Trump's supporters violently stormed the U.S. Capitol building in an attempt to disrupt the official certification of the election results. Biden was inaugurated as the 46th president later that month.
In 2022, the U.S. Supreme Court, in its Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization decision, overturned the landmark 1973 Roe v. Wade ruling, returning the issue of abortion to individual states. In 2024, Donald Trump won the presidential election, defeating Vice President Kamala Harris, who had become the Democratic nominee after President Biden withdrew from the race. Trump was inaugurated on January 20, 2025, becoming the 47th president of the United States, with J.D. Vance as his vice president, making him only the second president in American history, after Grover Cleveland, to serve 2 separate, non-consecutive terms. As of 2026, Trump's second term continues, with midterm congressional elections scheduled for November of that year.
So that's the story, or at least the outline of it. From the first people who crossed into this continent through Beringia at least 16 to 20,000 years ago, to 13 scrappy colonies, to a revolution, to a civil war that nearly tore the country apart over the question of who counted as fully human, to 2 world wars, a moon landing, a Cold War, and a 21st century still very much being written. What should stand out, looking back across all of it, is that American history isn't a single straight line of either constant progress or constant failure. It's both threads, tangled together the entire way.
The same country that wrote all men are created equal also enslaved millions of people. The same country that led the fight against fascism in World War II also interned its own citizens based on their ancestry. The same country that fell short again and again of its own founding ideals also kept producing generations of people who fought, protested, and sometimes died to close that gap between what America said it was and what it actually was. That tension between ideal and reality might be the single most American thing about American history, and it's still playing out today.
Thanks so much for watching this journey through the complete history of America, from the very first footsteps on this continent all the way to the world we're living in today. If a chapter of this story stuck with you, the Revolution, the Civil War, the Civil Rights Movement, or anything else, I want to hear about it. Drop a comment below and tell me which part of this story you'd want a full deep dive documentary on next, because honestly, every single chapter we covered today deserves its own hour. If you learned something new, or if this video gave you a fuller picture of where this country has been, do me a favor. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who'd enjoy it, and subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive. There's a lot more history and a lot more stories still to tell. I'll see you in the next one.